Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mark Groves podcast. I'm so excited for today's guest. His name is Will Roosh, and I have been stalking him online for a while, wanting to get him on the pod because I've been such an admirer of the way that he makes his way through the world, the way that he teaches viewpoint diversity and critical thinking. He's an educator, he works in high school education, he's a mentor, he's a successful podcaster, and the ability to critically think, to be taught that as a skill set, to be able to hold diverse perspective, we need it now more than ever. And I would say almost none of us got taught how to do that, how to hold complexity. So in this episode, we explore how to navigate difference, and we touch on subjects that are controversial and what Will's experience is, both online and in the classroom, in touching on the complexities of things like left and right and trans rights and all of that stuff. So we also explore how to be informed and discerning about the information we take in and how to build that muscle of critical thinking and so much more. So a quick reminder before we get into the episode that you might be listening to this and not subscribed. And if you miss episodes, you might miss a relational or life tip that changes your life, that prevents you from a breakup, that expands your relationships, that allows you, as in this episode, to be able to have more controversial and challenging conversations. And that, for you, would make me very sad. And what would feed my dopamine and make me very happy is if you hit the subscribe button so both of us can experience the elation of feeding our FOMO. I can't wait to get into this episode, and let's go. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mark Groves podcast. Today I am so excited. I've got Will Roosh. Welcome.
Thank you so much for bringing me on, man. I'm excited for this.
Man, I found your work, I want to say probably about a year ago, and just fell in love with the way that you explore very complex topics. One, in that you actually broach those topics, but two, that you do it in a way that really invites curiosity to each perspective. And that's an art in a place and a world and a social media space that does not even welcome the topic, but especially the exploration, which we see as the validation of both sides.
I think it's just my default, Mark. I think I'm just naturally so curious. It's just a hack from going from like, I know the right answers, I have the right answers, I'm smart, to like, I don't know anything. You know, I look at these quotes from Socrates and stuff, like, you know, about how the reason that why they believe that they're smart is because they realize they know nothing. I'm like, there's something to that. So leaning into that is just my default. I understand it's not normal, like the way that society works right now, but for me, that's the way society's working, I think is crazy. Like, how are you so sure about all of these things? It doesn't make any sense to me. So I just lean into curiosity. And in doing that, asking a lot of questions, my questions get better and better and better. And then before you know it, I'm like, oh, I know some things about some things.
Yeah, now I have an understanding of the complexity of the circumstance, the situation, the ideologies. For context, can you share with people what you do and maybe why you have a lens into this world?
Yeah, so I'm a high school teacher by trade. So I started teaching full-time in 2007, which is ironically the year the iPhone came out. So I've watched social media, you know, take over young minds too. So I've been teaching high school since 2007 all the way up until this year. Social science, so history, civics, economics, government, things like that. And so all of these like culture war issues started to show up in 2015, 2016, and I just started addressing them and saying, if this is a division in our country where almost half, or even if it's 30% of our population thinks this thing, there has to be something to it. You know, this idea of like, well, they're just all idiots or they're just all ignorant. It's like, no, I don't think so. There's something to it. So again, I leaned into curiosity, trying to understand why people would think differently than me, why people would think differently than like the status quo and all that kind of stuff. And I just kind of hammered into that, and then started a social media presence, doing exactly what I was doing in my classroom in like 2018. And just put it out there to see like, are other people interested in this other than just my students? Because my students were really receptive to it. And that's like kind of how I grew on like Instagram and stuff.
What do you think fed to it being, like you were saying, there's this delineation one where smartphones come in, but then there's also a 2015 culture war. Yeah. What do you think fed that? Or what were the circumstances that bred that?
In the country.
Yeah.
It's a lot. I think that the abundance of information that comes when your phone is just in your pocket, I think that's definitely going to be part of it. Is they can always seek confirmation bias. So whatever you believe, you can find experts, you can find people with a bunch of letters next to their name to validate your position, and that's what people tend to do. So instead of like back in the day where there would be like 3 channels, then you'd watch, they'd have to kind of aim for the middle. But then Roger Ailes and Rupert Murdoch, he's Roger Ailes, right? Started Fox News, and they were like, we're just going to hammer our base. And that set the model that everyone else, CNN does that now, MSNBC, obviously.
Like just amplify one.
Just hammer that, and then people get what they want to hear. And I think that's what's happening on social media is you only consume the stuff that gives you that whatever dopamine hit, that bit of like, oh, you're right, you're smart, that kind of stuff. And then so all of society gets fractured into these things where we have totally different news, totally different information coming at us. And I think that became abundantly clear when like Trump won in 2016. And half the country was like, yeah, obviously. And then half the country or more was just like, you got to be kidding me. This is crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember being, as a Canadian, I remember observing what was going on politically in the U.S. I think for a lot of Canadians, we have paid more attention to U.S. politics than our own. And maybe that's just a projection of my own experience. But what I noticed was I had never seen so much hate towards an idea of someone, which I actually had a hard time understanding how anyone liked him. And the Canadian media, for sure, more liberal leaning, more left leaning, more like, before I would have said that we had some balanced reporting during COVID. That changed. Like we definitely now it's much more liberal, left wing, information that's coming through. We don't have like a Fox. We do have a news outlet called Rebel News, but I mean, even their name in first is like, it sort of delegitimizes it. And I would say it's a bit BuzzFeedy. So when I started to see what was going on in the US, and I remember thinking, oh, someone's telling me they are a Republican. Immediately I had the same like, oh my God, like how?
They're a bad person or something.
Yeah,
like that too,
and maybe I hadn't gotten that far, but I was still like, how do you vote for that person? And so I was so quick to put them in a box that I wasn't curious to what appeals to somebody. Like on the podcast, I had someone mention Trump once, and then someone was so mad that they mentioned him in a negative way that someone gave it a 1-star review because they were upset that anyone who's called associated with Trump is bad.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, there's a lot of validity to that you just name something and all of a sudden there's no openness anymore. There's no curiosity. Like something appeals about what he says or else he wouldn't win.
Yeah, clearly. And, I remember going to school, like the day of the elections, that Tuesday, I was like, guys, don't worry about it. I'm looking at the polls. I was like, Hillary Clinton's going to win. And then he didn't. And I was like, all right, interesting. Went to school and students were crying. Teachers were crying in front of their class. And the mistake that people made, like I think people in media especially made, was they said, how could you possibly vote for this guy? Instead of, how could you vote for this guy? Like, it was a rhetorical question, not a sincere question. And I tended to lean into the sincere question of like, I got to figure out what's going on here because I was confused.
Because it's reality.
Yeah. So let's figure this out. And that put me on a journey that really opened my mind up to why people would support him. And yeah, I don't think he's like a great person, but I understand now pretty well why people would vote for him. And that's a mistake I think a lot of people in media did. They just assumed that they knew that he was evil and that anyone who voted for him was just ignorant instead of like actually getting curious.
Why do you think people voted for him and are likely going to vote for him?
I think it's a big FU to like the system, like the institutions that are in power. It's like the powerful elite, which is ironic because he has like gold toilets in his skyscraper, but in some way he is like the guy who represents. I talked to someone who is from South Carolina and he said, I voted for Trump. I knew he was a Yankee, but he didn't vilify me. He was like a truck driver or something. He's like, I come home with grease under my fingernails. I'm a hardworking guy. I'm trying to provide for a family. And Trump didn't say I was bad because I'm like white. I'm a white man. So he felt like this idea of like the identity politics stuff was just like he was always getting the like shit end of the stick on that, and it was the first time that he saw, at least between Hillary and Trump in 2016, that it was like, all right, well, he's representing me, so I'll go with him. But I think bigger than that. It's if all of these powerful institutions are against this guy, then he might be the guy.
It's like the Barbra Streisand effect.
Yeah.
It's like, don't look at that,
Right.
don't, and then all of a sudden it amplifies it.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah, and I think Trump is, he was never kind of accepted in like high society, even though he was like from that world with his dad and everything like that. Like we went to boarding school and stuff. They all kind of like looked at him like a joke. So he went into the celebrity world, the Hollywood world, and he was liked, by the people in the View were like Donald Trump, giving him hugs and stuff like that. But as soon as he turned against them, because they didn't like him, they were like the type to say like, Donald, you can't come to the party. Like, you're not one of us. You're too buffoonish or whatever. So then he turned against them, and then he's like their big bull. Like he's like their guy. He's like the king of the a-holes almost. Who's stick it to the big elite and the corporations and stuff like that. I think that's what's appealing about him.
Yeah, and I think for people listening or watching, it's like, can we hold hearing his name without being activated? Can we hold hearing Joe Biden's name without being activated? It's hard.
Yeah.
Because these things, it's almost like, I remember arguing with a friend about some of the COVID policies.
Mm-hmm.
And I was saying to her, it's interesting because you and I are actually pivoting around the same values. We're orienting around the same values. We're just doing it differently. And you're moralizing yours. Because I was open to the way they saw things, but they were not open to the way I saw things. And immediately, if there's no like eye to eye, there's no curiosity, then there's no conversation.
Yeah.
And it's like, it feels like there's, as the ideological extremes get amplified, it's, if we don't build bridges to each other, we're fucked.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to do all the time. Trying to build that in my students when they're young, and then also, to whoever, because that's a core part of what America is this idea of like Hamilton and Jefferson didn't get along, but they had to find compromise. They had to work things out. And now, because we're in these ideological echo chambers, we're not. And, I get called like a MAGA person, Trump. I've never voted for him. I don't like the guy, but I find myself defending him because I think there are legitimate critiques of him, but there's also illegitimate ones. There's a lot of things that people have said about him that's not true. And I want to separate the good from the bad, the same way that like if you label everything racist, then where are the real racists? And I want to know who the real racists are. If you label everything a Nazi, then who are the real Nazis? And I think that's the danger too, is if you can't even, you get triggered by hearing his name, then you're not going to be open to what is appealing about him. It looks like he's in the lead to be president again. So if you don't pay attention to what that is, then he's going to, if you don't want him to be president, you should probably pay attention to what he's tapping into. Which is maybe what I said earlier, but there's probably a lot more to it than that.
I actually wonder that a lot too, when I look at, let's say, like the left or Democrats, and in Canada, that would be the Liberals or the NDP. Mm-hmm. I really think to myself, like, are you guys watching? Are you watching? Like, are you actually paying attention to what is working? Who's your strategist? Because whoever your strategist is, they're not good, because you're losing. You're losing, and you're pushing forward the same ideological bullying. And this isn't to say that doesn't exist everywhere, but it's to say, like, I used to identify as being more liberal because I'm more into social programs. I'm more into wanting equality, people to have access to everything that they could possibly for a good life. But then I got to this place during COVID where I was like, wait, I'm not allowed to ask questions anymore. And part of the membership to being in, I think, what would be perceived as the far left is that you actually can't. Like, if you don't believe this, you're a bad person. And I found, well, there's no flexibility then. And I saw, maybe this is more true in Canada, but I saw that people in Canada identify as being good. Like, we're good people, we're nice. Yeah. There's a joke in the world that we apologize for everything, which that's very conflict avoidant, and that's actually pretty codependent. And so I started to see, like, well, the messaging during COVID was very much like, you're a good person, have each other's back. Sure. And that messaging wasn't just in Canada, that was in lockstep. The exact same marketing messaging across, I would say, most Western countries, right?
Yeah.
And like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, I think they're called the Five Eyes. Okay. Yeah. And I look at all that and I'm like, well, that seems to be the same sort of now. If you don't question things, you're on this side of good, you want to help people. And if you don't, you're bad. And so I feel like there's this space. I think we can look at right-wing extremism and see that it has a pretty explicit shadow side, right? Racism, bigotry, misogyny, etc. The left doesn't think its own shit stinks. And the shadow side of that is that if you don't think you can be captured by an ideology, that's actually what makes you capturable.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, I agree with you 100%. I wonder how much of this is the lack of like a moral guidebook. In my civics class, I talk a lot about morals. So we cover like philosophical lens, Aristotle, Plato, Immanuel Kant and stuff like that. But then we do like the social science lens. Like I love Jonathan Haidt. I love his stuff, and like Righteous Mind
and his stuff
is
now.
So good.
And Coddling of the American Mind. One of my favorite books, because it really finally it makes sense. All this stuff that I've been like feeling in my body of like, why is there such a lack of safety to disagree?
Yeah. His book Righteous Mind has like the moral foundations of like basically that we have like these moral taste buds, and they're different between liberals and conservative based on your psychological tendencies of like openness to experience and things like that. But also a religious lens. Religious practice is declining. So I think with all of those things, people aren't aware of like a lot of the social science behind it. They don't read philosophy anymore, really.
Yeah.
They're losing like religious practice. So what is your moral guidebook? How do you even know right from wrong? And they don't.
That's
so they go to like these like easy ones. Racism, clearly bad. So anti-racism, Ibram Kenny, whatever, clearly good.
Right. So anything that's anti,
it's just so
not
simple,
that it's not legitimized, right? Like DEI, I know is a big. He talks. Jonathan Haidt is also talking a lot about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, because it's like diversity, wonderful, equity. Yeah, sure. Let's, equitable treatment and inclusion. Like it all sounds so good. So if you don't understand the depth of it, then you could say like, I have a place, a safe haven for needy children in a third world country. That sounds wonderful, but then it's a sweatshop. You know what I mean? Like you can label something whatever you want, but like what's actually going on there? And that's what's happened a lot in these culture wars. I think that's a lack of a moral standard. And that just leads people to just pick up really surface level ones.
That's interesting. Instead of it being a morality, it's a behavior or like a side.
And it's just so quick.
Right.
Yeah.
It creates safety. It's like decision heuristics. I remember when during COVID, I spoke out a lot because I really had a problem with the psychological manipulation that was going on in order to get people to take the product, which I understood the intention. It's just that to me, they really weaponized belonging and community. And, in processing that, I realized they like violated the sacredness of our relationships and said, if your uncle doesn't take it, he's not welcome at dinner anymore. Right. And I was like, you don't get to do that. Like, and the person who doesn't invite them, I don't blame them, because they're doing the exact thing that the psychological thing is meant to do to them.
Yeah.
So when I look at, and that's why there's so much overlap, because if you look at what is the archetype of a right-winger, anti-vax, transphobic, racist, right? There's like anything. And on the other side, it's pro-mask, pro-vaccine, which I think is crazy now to think like, in my experience at least, the left used to be anti-pharma.
Yeah.
Used to be anti-war. And now I'm like, I feel like I'm in Zoolander. I'm like, what is this? A school for ants? Like it feels like I've left reality.
Yeah, that's a strange one. Like the pro-war stuff side, the like, bodily autonomy stuff.
Yeah.
The big corporations and stuff like that. All these big corporations are all like, because of like ESG scores are like, for lack of a better term, it's a pejorative term, but like woke. And so because of that, it's very interesting how they did that pivot. I think it was economist Pia Milani said something like, in the 1990s, Bill Clinton barely won, like early 90s. And before that, Republicans were just crushing because the Democrats were the party of labor. So if you're the party of labor, you have to deliver certain things like better working conditions, less hours, better pay, stuff like that. So the donor class, the people who own these corporations, are like, well, I'm not going to vote for that.
Right.
So they were giving their corporate donations to the Republican Party, and the Republicans were crushing the Democrats. So when Bill Clinton got in, he's like, we got to be competitive in this. So they switched from being the party of labor to being a party of identity. And if you look at the Republican platform now, it's a lot about identity. It's like, I see you Filipinos. And that's it. Like, you don't have to deliver anything for them. You're the party of them, which is
Yeah.
why, like, when George Floyd passed, like, was killed, like, Nancy Pelosi would like take a knee and like the African garb, and like it's all this like identity stuff. But who gets left out then are the working class. If you think about someone wearing a MAGA hat, it's less likely it's someone at Princeton on the row team, like the old the idea of conservative.
Yes, yeah.
Now it's like a truck driver. It's someone who's like covered in grease at the end of the day and stuff like that.
That's
Tends
so
to be more MAGA.
interesting.
In LA, most of my friends who are like hardcore Trump supporters are like Hispanic laborers. It's interesting.
That is.
Yeah.
It's such a mindfuck because it's
Yeah.
flipped.
Yeah.
It's flipped completely. Yeah, it's so true because I would have thought, I mean, I'm not from here, but in my perspective, if you were like that tall white guy on the rowing team at Yale, I'd be like, for sure, Republican. And now,
Yeah, I mean, you see what's on the campuses. It's not that way at all. I mean, if they are, it's really on the down low.
yeah, I had a guy on here who used to teach at a university in Nevada, and he was saying to me that if he mentioned the name Trump in class, students would the ones who were actually Republican wouldn't speak up. They were afraid of being attacked or shamed by the people. And I'm like, man, have we created that little ideological safety to actually explore things and deconstruct them? In your classroom with high school students, are you an outlier as a teacher who's,
Oh yeah.
yeah, especially in LA? Like, is that, like, do other teachers see you as being right-wing extremist?
I don't know about extremists. They probably think I'm more conservative, which I might be, even though I haven't like
Now because of the
yeah,
shift?
but yeah, right. It's like who's to even say like what that is? But I mean, I have great relationships with my like colleagues and stuff like that. But I think my students understand what I'm doing. I think my colleagues do too. And I've gotten challenged on things. We had like an assembly on gun violence, and one of my colleagues was next to me, and she was like, I just think it's crazy that anyone could just walk into a store, to a Walmart, and pick up a machine gun and just walk out. And I'm like, well, that's not true at all. Like, here's what you actually have to do. And so it was I just revealed some of like her ignorance, and then she's kind of stopped talking about the topic, so like when they try to like, challenge me on something, I just know this stuff very well because I seek disconfirmation, because I'm trying to understand the other side. So I have my stances on like these controversial issues, like, like pro-life, pro-choice. Like, I can just argue both of them because I really understand the perspectives of both. And I think that's what helps me as an educator is I can, if the class is leaning one way, I can present them with like, here's what's away from you. Something that Jonathan Haidt says is that ideologies bind and blind. So they bind us to like, oh, you're on this side? Me too. Boom, high five. Okay,
Right.
Now we have like a tribe, but it also blinds you to what the other perspective is. And that's the danger. And that's what's happening with all these people who like they despise Trump, and you say like, can you name 2 positive things about him? They're like, no, there's nothing. Like he, the First Step program, like, prison reform, better access to kidney dialysis treatments. Like there are things that he did. And I can say those and it's like, oh, you're a Trump supporter. It's like, well, no, I never voted for him. And then it's like that pinwheel. They just
melting,
like does not compute. You know what I mean? But that's how you become a critical thinker. That's how you become a serious thinker, I think, is by understanding the whole topic, not just what the side that you tend to align with.
What do you think is the best way to actually, like, what are the skills necessary to sit? Because I certainly, if I hear someone votes for Biden now, I see people get enraged, right?
Right.
And in Canada, that's like we're experiencing a similar.
Trudeau.
Yeah, he's definitely the most disliked he's ever been.
Even by the left now.
Oh
Right.
yeah. He has the lowest approval rating. And like, I was listening to Ram Dass the other day. One just happened to pop up. Like, YouTube was like, you probably need this right now. And I was listening to it, and it was saying, he was talking about how he had this, I think it was a Secretary of State. I mean, this is probably from the 80s, this conversation. And he was saying, I couldn't open my heart just thinking about him. And he's like, it's not that he was bad. He just wasn't right. And so I was like, how perfect, because, and he said, so he would put the picture of this, I think it was a Secretary of State or something. He would put him on his mantle beside like Christ, beside his teacher Maharaji, and he would practice opening his heart. And he said he was my guru dressed in drag. Like, and I thought, what an interesting perspective, because for me, that for sure is like, Trudeau has felt that way for me, because what he represented was the dehumanization and the beginning, or not the beginning, but the amplification of division. And so I see the same now. I know people who really hate him, and there's a part of me that can be fed by that. And I'm like, that's not productive. Like
Yeah.
it's not productive because I still need to understand why would someone vote for them? Because if I'm not curious, then they're not curious.
Yeah.
I create the same, if the judgment precedes the question, the judgment's what's felt.
Yeah. And then you fight that judgment, because I do the same thing. I fight that judgment with like a lot of questions. So if someone says like, I'm a hardcore Biden supporter, typically it seems to be that people aren't hardcore Biden supporters. They're just hardcore anti-Trump. I think the whole thing revolves around this orange entity. So they're either hardcore Trump or hardcore anti-Trump.
Even Republicans are now a bit anti-Trump.
Yeah.
So it's like, I thought, man, maybe the Dems will at least offer the opportunity for RFK Jr., but
no, he's an interesting guy too.
Yeah, he is.
I mean, people were critical of me because I said that that's probably who I'm going to vote for, because I didn't vote for Trump or Biden last time. I didn't vote for Trump or Hillary last. I always voted third party, just because I just don't want to participate in this binary game. And some people say that that's wrong. And I'm a civics teacher. I'm a government teacher. So how dare I throw my vote away? But it's like, I don't subscribe to that idea. I think that there's something like, 40% or more of American citizens who are eligible to vote don't vote. So if all of them could vote and they voted for RFK, then he would. Now, I don't think RFK is perfect at all.
Yeah.
But I do think that he's more spry. I do think that he has better ideas. I think he's also more anti, corporate greed and stuff like that than other people. Like people say he's like anti-vax. Like he might say some things that are goofy, but he's also pointed out things that are true. And I think at the very least, what he's acknowledging is the regulatory capture. Our regulatory agencies, one of the jobs that government's supposed to do is make sure that corporations don't get out of control. But now when you look at like how the percentage of funding that goes to like the FDA from the drug companies, it's a lot. I think it's a majority. It's like 60% of the funding.
Which is wild.
It's so crazy. And that's the way it is with so many things, because who's going to fund these studies on food? Who's going to fund them? Who has a lot of money? Nabisco, PepsiCo, whatever it is, they're going to fund these studies and they're going to get the information that they want. So I think that what he represents to a lot of people, RFK does, is this idea of like, corporations can't just run things. That's what we had in like the Gilded Age, like the late 1800s, is we had these corporations, Rockefeller, Carnegie, just kind of running the show. And that's not good. And it comes at the expense of a lot of the labor class and the working class and stuff like that. And I think that, I don't know, I don't think Biden, I don't think Trump either is really looking out for the working class. I think Trump kind of acknowledges them a little bit more maybe, but I think that's what RFK represents. But he's so crushed by this system that wants it to be binary. The Democrats want just Republicans as their enemy. Republicans want just Democrats, and they're cool with that. They both gerrymander. They both play the same game. They both, they live in the same areas and stuff like that. And when a real outsider like RFK comes in, then they're like, all right, we're teamed up on this. And he's interesting because they don't really know if he's going to pull votes from Trump or Biden.
Right.
Which is really cool.
That actually is really interesting because he represents the lost center, which I don't know the statistics, but it feels like 1% is far left and 1% is far right, because there's 98% of us who are going like, can we get an adult back in the room? Like,
I think 70% of Americans were polled that said they don't want Biden or Trump again. 70%. So how are we a republic?
But if you're one of those parties, are you not like, oh, we should then scrap our person, get someone who appeals more to the center, to maybe the right, not the right, but like everything left, right of left is now right. But I'm curious. I'm like, why wouldn't they just put someone? Now, I think the Republicans they can't. I do think though that the left, it's like, I had a friend who was like a diehard Democrat, and I was like, I just need to know, like, just so I can be connected to reality, do you think he's playing with a full cerebral deck? And they were like, no. And I'm like, thank God. Like, at least we're able to acknowledge that.
Sky's blue. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, but what Biden does, and it's not just him, it's whoever his kind of handlers are and his like team. It's like the party is in power, not him, the party. But he plays ball. There's not a lot of politicians that I like. As a government teacher, I always joke around, like I'm a government teacher that hates government. But Tulsi Gabbard is someone I think has a lot of integrity. And she stood up to the Democratic Party and they just crushed her. And I think like someone like her, if they put their machine behind her, she would do really well.
She appeals to the right too.
I think she's balanced,
she's
on a
like
lot of things.
Clinton kind of, because he was more, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, like more conservative, I think. But but she also is not. She's not. Clinton leaned heavy into like helping like corporate growth. Like, he shut down a lot of the offshooting of like factories and stuff from like, Midwest. They all get shipped them out to China and Mexico and stuff like that. That was really bad for like NAFTA and things along those lines. But I think the problem with Tulsi Gabbard or RFK or someone like that is they're not going to play ball. Like the ones who play ball, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, what they did was they were all running against Joe Biden. And then overnight, basically, they're all like, we're dropping out. We're going behind Joe Biden, because they got a phone call, I'm sure, that was like, hey, this is about party. Trump is an existential threat. We have to beat him. That's the way they see it. They see Trump as a true existential threat, like a Sam Harris said, it's like a meteor like skyrocketing toward Earth. So we have to do whatever we can. So let's all get on board to stop him. And they all just play ball. And for someone who says, I'm not going to play ball, I'm not going to do what goes against my morals. They have a moral code. Then they go, no, I'm not going to do that. And those people, the Democratic Party won't pick them up. They tried to do that with Trump, because Trump won't play ball either, but he was just so popular that they couldn't. They tried to, before he ever beat Hillary Clinton, he beat a whole stage of Republicans, and they did not want him, but he appealed to the reality show kind of like culture of America. He would get up there and people would have all these notes, Ted Cruz would have all these notes about like data and stuff. And he'd just go up and say like, your dad killed JFK or something like that. And he's just like, just throws his cards over his shoulders. Like, how do I deal with this? He called people like, little hands and sweaty this. And people in America just love that, because they just love reality show. And he was a reality show star before
celebrity.
He was a president. And he just knows how to get the masses, as a populist, get the masses behind him. And it's not like good necessarily, but I think that the Republicans were just like, well, we have to support him because clearly the people want him.
Yeah.
And when the Democrats, people were behind Bernie Sanders. Now, he didn't win a lot of like skits like nerdy like Democrat stuff. He didn't win a lot of like super delegates and stuff. But the Democratic Party said, okay, I know a lot of you want Bernie Sanders, but no, we're giving you Hillary Clinton. And it was a mistake. I think if it was Bernie versus Trump, I think Bernie would have won, honestly. But I think what happened was a lot of people on the left said they wanted Bernie. Bernie just capitulated and said like, all right, no, I'm going to go behind Hillary. And then they gave Hillary, when people said, we don't want her, she's not likable, and they put her there anyway. And the Republicans played it smart. They could have just said like, I know you want Trump, but we're going to give you Ted Cruz. And they didn't. Yeah. I think that's probably what happened in 2016 too.
That's interesting. There's so many layers to it.
Yeah. Is it interesting? I feel like sometimes government's so like not, but I don't know.
Well, I think because it is currently having such an influence on our lives and our families and our relationships. Like, there's people who break up because of this stuff. There's
people don't want to date people that the people are open. I just saw this like this morning, I think. People are more willing to date outside of like their racial category now than ever, which is great, but they're less likely than ever to date outside of their political affiliation.
Yeah, I remember reading a study on college students that said, how willing were you to share a dorm room with someone with an opposing political view? And the Republicans were more open than the Democrats. I always bring those types of things forward because the perception is that the Republican is the less open person and the Dem is the more open person. Again, I don't want to vilify one side, but it's if we can't see the shadow side of our own behavior and our unwillingness to be curious, then we can't change.
Yeah.
And it's like the people who are identifying as being in service of good, which there are good aspects of it, of course, but it's like they identify as that, so everything, they're not accountable to the way that which they achieve that. Much like you were talking about how like, of course, anti-racism is good. Of course, pro-medicine that could save everybody is good, right? But it's like anything that questions it doesn't, it's not this trap that's immediately, if you question it, you're against it. You reject the idea. Right? Which is a false binary. And then we all fall into it. And I think when you add on things like cancel culture, you're like, well, I don't want to say this because all my friends talk shit about that type of person. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly what happens. I don't know where this is going to go. I think that there's enough people now with revealing what happened with COVID, seeing what's going on, not being cool with Trump or Biden. I think there's enough people that are just over it. But part of the reason why I became in this like category of like the anti-woke, which is how I like kind of like my account grew and stuff like that, as I was pushing back against like critical social justice stuff. Part of the reason why is because of the unwillingness, just like you're saying, the unwillingness of the people who are critical social justice, woke, DEI, to engage in conversation. I got asked to go on like Glenn Beck and Fox News, and people are like, how are you going on Fox News? I'm like, they're the only ones who are asking me.
Yeah.
Like, I don't watch Fox News. I went on like Fox News Tonight. I didn't know who the host was. I didn't know anything about it. Okay, I don't watch that stuff. But Anderson Cooper wasn't calling me. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I think that's a real thing. It's like the conservatives seem more willing when like Turning Point USA, like Charlie Kirk or Ben Shapiro, like when they have a liberal student there, they say, you can go to the front of the line to ask me a question. You'll never see that. You'll never see Ibram Kendi or Nicole Hannah-Jones or any of those people who are like in like the woke side ever have a long form debate. You're familiar with Coleman Hughes?
Yeah.
Okay, so Coleman Hughes asked Ibram Kendi politely, said, let's have a formal open discussion. We're going to sell tickets, raise money for the United Negro College Fund, and we'll donate that. Kendi said no. It's like
Coleman Hughes is so open.
Yeah.
And he's a
Like, let's go.
brilliant conversationalist.
Yeah. But so I tend to lean on the side of the ones who are willing to talk. And if you're not willing to talk, then I just have to assume that you're on the bad side.
Well, it
And that might not
invalidates
even be
your
true.
perspective on
Yeah.
some level, you
Yeah.
know, because you're not willing to stand to the criticism or the feedback on how you see things that is based on emotion often, not facts, emotion. And I hear a lot of the time the conversation is, I do not want to platform them.
Yeah.
I don't want to amplify their voice in this righteous, I'm doing this for all of us. And I think of human history and I'm like, at some point we're going to have to, like, there's there's 20% of people who clearly are against all of it and standing up, and then there's 20 who are like pro everything, and then there's 60% that are like, oh, like,
Yeah.
what do I do? And that's if more people speak to just the irrationale of things and start to step into more critical thinking and conversation. What starts to be modeled is then other people, the group that will not discuss anything start to not be the norm. Do you know what I mean?
That's the hope. But like this idea of platform, I couldn't disagree with that more. I think that when people have bad ideas, what you do is you just give them lots of time. You got to keep on the line. I did a video kind of went viral about, I was talking to 3 other critical race theory teachers, and it was.
Oh, I saw that video.
It's tough to watch, right?
It's hard because it's like, wait, you just said, maybe explain to people.
Well, it's just, what I did was it was like kind of 3 verse 1. I just went in with questions, Socratic method, just asking questions and stuff like that. And I just kept giving them rope because I didn't want to, I don't engage in I don't insult people, personal attacks or anything like that, because I just don't think it's productive. But what happened was I kept them on the line by asking questions, but also like giving them wins, like often, like, yeah, I acknowledge that. Oh, that's really smart, blah, blah, blah. So I kept them on for like an hour and a half. And when you keep them on, you have them like develop their ideas. You can tell that they haven't met any kind of resistance with these ideas before, because when I offer just little questions, they start to like break down. They get like more and more radical.
They get emotional. I saw that.
Yeah. So they go right into, well, it hurts me, so I'm not, you can't even ask that kind of question. It's not an appropriate question to ask or anything like that. And that's that. If you think someone has a bad idea, I really believe then what you do is you just lean into asking the questions. And what you're going to find out is that they're probably grossly ignorant about the thing that they're so passionate about, or they have a whole bunch of information that you did not know, and now you're going to walk out better. But that's, I had Daryl Davis on my podcast twice. Really interesting guy. He was a jazz musician, piano player. And he met with someone who was in the Ku Klux Klan. He's a black guy. Met with someone who was in the Ku Klux Klan and befriended him. Started going to Klan rallies and stuff like that. He's an awesome TED Talk. Went to Klan rallies and stuff. And then down the road, like they formed like good friendship, even though he's a black man. These guys were in the Ku Klux Klan. And like a year or two.
He went to Klan rallies?
Yeah, he went to Klan rallies.
As a black guy?
Yes.
Wow.
And he's a badass. Like just went and just like, asked them questions and talked to them and like highlighted their logical fallacies and stuff like that. But the guy who he initially befriended came to his house one day and had a box. He goes, "Here you go, Daryl, I got this for you." He opened it up. It was his Ku Klux Klan robe. Daryl's like, "I don't want this." And he goes, "I don't want it either." He's like, I'm out. He's like, I gave up the lifestyle because of you and my friendship with you. And then since then, he's taken like 300 people out of, neo-Nazi groups, Ku Klux Klan members, they gave it up because he platformed them. More than that, he befriended them. Like, that's incredible. Where what the culture now would say is like, as soon as someone says, I'm a racist, you get up and you walk out. So what do you think happens to them then? Do you think they just go, oh, you know what? I guess that's the error of my ways. I guess I shouldn't be racist anymore. No, they
Yeah,
go
they left
underground.
me, right?
They go underground, it festers, and they find other people, and they just form that group underground. Same thing with like an Alex Jones or someone like that is like, I think what you do, I've had a lot of teachers who say like, he's so terrible. I said, then what you do is you assign something that's highlight all the areas that he's wrong, all the things he's been wrong about, you know, and then you point those out and then acknowledge some of the things he's been right about.
Right.
And then you get a more robust understanding. You're not supposed to be an Alex Jones fan if you don't want to be a fan. It's not about that. It's about understanding who he is. But when you shut him down, everyone goes InfoWars to underground. They don't give up on him or his ideas. He has a persecution complex. Shutting him down and canceling him just highlights that.
Amplifies.
Yeah, that's what it does with the Trump people too, I think.
That's so true too. And it triggers us emotionally, and then we get more rigid in our passions and our ideologies, right? Because we're like, even the name Alex Jones triggers people's nervous systems. The name Trump, the name Biden, the name, right? So it's like, this is how dysregulated we are. This is how easy we are to derail. Like, that's sad. But I would argue that that's not anyone's fault, although it's our responsibility to learn how to regulate and be curious when we're upset, because that's the core of successful relating.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's because we're consuming endless amounts of news that pisses us off and makes us afraid. We're consuming endless amounts of social media short form content, which the algorithm amplifies the stuff that's the most amplified in terms of its messaging and its triggering and its confirmation. And so it's like, everything is designed to make it so we're not regulated.
Yeah.
Like, look at all the health issues people have. The new book from Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation.
Yeah, that's great.
It's like, of course we have anxiety. Like, we're not even present. If you're not present, you can't choose your life. If you can't choose your life, you're going to be anxious. You know, so there's like all these layers to it. And then when I think about what you were saying about starting to point out the validity of things as you oppose them, you know, that you're able to point out all of it. I think what that does too is it disarms the person who's pro whatever, because they're like, yeah, that's true. Like, yeah, I am right about that. But it opens them up because they feel witnessed, they feel seen. And I had a trans woman on the podcast named Julia Malat, who's incredible. And she was saying that, so she is different than someone would assume in the education system in Canada. She was vehemently against calling people transphobic and shutting off their microphones the moment they were critical of something, because she was like, if you don't allow them to speak about their concerns, you actually increase trans hate.
Yeah.
You actually create more transphobia, because what gets blamed is trans people when the person actually doing it is like a straight white woman, for example. Yeah. And she's like, that's not in service of a conversation. If you just shut down the dialogue, you amplify the resistance to the thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're seeing that a lot, at least culturally. When comedians take things on, I think they, you know, during COVID, they almost weren't able to do that anymore. And to lose comedy and to lose satire that points out the ridiculous nature of whatever we're doing currently, there's no longer a rudder to reality. It's almost like comedians go to an extreme of making jokes about stuff, and we kind of go, ha ha, oh, you know?
Canaries in the coal mine a little bit. Like, you go after the comedian. It's like I've heard this said, like, when the king kills the court jester, that's how you know he's a tyrannical king. Like, you can't even laugh at yourself.
Oh, wow.
That's a real problem.
That's
and I think that's what's happening with you know, like Kevin Hart got canceled from the Oscars and stuff like that because of a tweet that he made, like, you know, years ago.
In 2004 or something. Yeah.
Yeah, that element of people just don't like the nuance. They don't like the complexity. And I don't know. Do you think you naturally, Mark, like that complexity? Or did you have to like forge yourself to be that way? Because I think I naturally like it.
I love the complexity of human systems, but I found myself when I was no longer in the like norm during COVID, I found myself wanting to latch on to the simplicity because it was safer. Like, I was afraid that I wasn't able to choose what I wanted for my body, and the data wasn't enough or compelling enough for me. And I started, because I worked in pharma for 14 years, I was reading the studies, but I also taught consulting programs on the science of influence. I launched drugs. So I knew what was going on as they were marketing it. Oh. And so I was in this this awareness space where I was like, oh, this is fucked. And where I normally would have just asked a question and people on my platform would have been like, great question. It was like, you're not allowed to ask the question. So I found myself, due to being afraid, wanting to cling to you're pro, you're bad, you're not allowing me the space to make a choice. But I realize now in hindsight, it's only through entering back into the nuance and asking questions that anyone's going to be open to my resistance anyways. Okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I do a podcast. It's called Cylinder Radio. The idea is like that there's different perspectives. So a cylinder from one side looks like a circle, from the other side looks like a rectangle, but it's like confusing. So every controversial topic I've covered. Guns, abortion. I've had 9 different transgender people on. Some like that were there like on January 6th wearing MAGA hats, and then like blue-haired activists. And you realize that like people are diverse, just all across. We're all the ultimate minority as the ultimate as the individual. But how you identify seems to really matter. Like how you see yourself. And there's trans people who that the first way they see themselves is as like a man or a woman or whatever it is. And there's other trans people, they see themselves as like a computer programmer or a BMX rider. And then they get less triggered. It's like my wife was vegan for a little bit, for like a year or two, solely because she likes restrictive diets. It's just like a way for her to keep on top of her diet. It wasn't like to save animals, save the planet, anything like that. So when she would be presented with data about how vegan diets aren't healthy or they kill a lot of animals or something, she was just like, oh well. Like,
it wasn't relevant.
But if your name was like Vegan Girl 35 or something like that, and you were like, that was your identity, and someone presents something that's like alternative to that, then you see it as like, it's like psychological backfire effect. Like you see it as like you're actually being attacked. Like your brain doesn't know the difference between that and like a bear's running after you. So someone who's like hardcore MAGA, if you present like Donald Trump's not a great guy, he's cheated on all his wives, he's screwed over all these workers over the years, blah, 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 blah. They just don't know how to handle that because their identity is as like a Trump supporter. So you take that away, then who am I?
Right.
So you got to be very careful about how you identify. You've talked to a lot of interesting people. Like, have you seen any elements of that, like idea of like identity come up as like a big thing, or is that just something that I've noticed?
No, I definitely see that. I make the joke often when, I'm on Instagram, if someone's name is like recovering from narcissism, I'm like, well, who are you? Like, will you ever be done recovering? Because your identity, like your label, and I poke at it, but it's like grief, getting over grief, Ruby, and you're like, well, if it is part of your identity, will you let it go ever? Right. And the idea, if you're an activist in some space, then who are you without the activism? I think what it's really amplifying, this is something that I'm starting to put together and play with a little more now. So for you watching, this sentence has not been formulated well, is that what I see is a lot of trauma bonding, and I see a lot of vulnerable narcissism in these activist groups where they are constantly victimized. And this is not the negation of the experience of victimization, right? I remember listening, because I wanted to hear someone break down that from an opposing view. So I listened to The Madness of Crowds from Douglas Murray,
that's great.
Which was great. And he was talking about how, let's say, for example, intersectionality was a theory that lived in academia, was not tested within, but then all of a sudden it became this, it just is. Yeah. Intersectionality is just something, and it's supposed to help increase compassion and understanding of the different intersections that people are born into, right? Yeah. And I remember listening to a podcast that Julia Malott did with someone else, I can't remember the guy's name, and he said, gender is one of the only things one of the only intersections you can choose. That all of a sudden you are now a victim because of how you identify, not that you're born as a woman or a person of color, right? And I was like, that's fascinating. Like, can we play with that idea without people getting really activated? Yeah. I mean, I said on my Instagram stories, I don't know, maybe a month ago, like it's actually really interesting to me that it's considered phobic to say biological sex is real. And that to me is like, okay, can we play with the edges? And of course I got replies like, you're clearly transphobic, and I was like, wow, I'm even talking about it and I'm getting the trope. Yeah. So I definitely see it, but what I'm really seeing is, I see this now with the term neurodivergence. Okay. Not that I don't think there is a such thing as neurodivergence. Again, this isn't an either or, there's both and. There's a lot of complexity.
Which is everyone is now.
Yeah, well, there's like this interesting. I had a friend do a post where he was saying like he really sees the value of small talk. And someone wrote, well, this isn't a neurodivergently informed post. Neurodivergent people are not good at small talk. And I was like, okay, well, that's interesting because now you're someone who is special. But not only are you special, you see the specialness in other people. So now you are from a hierarchy up here because you're good and you're doing and you're calling out this. So you're in the trauma triangle all the time.
Yeah.
You're never the perpetrator and you're either the victim or the savior or both. And so I'm like, wow, the trauma triangle is like playing out in all this activism. But I also saw myself when I look in hindsight being in between perpetrator and victim savior and victim in terms of what occurred during COVID.
Yeah.
So I started to see my own, where I was like, oh, fuck, and then by doing that, you do become the perpetrator. Your self-identity is I'm doing it. I'm trying to help people. I'm trying to get everyone to see everyone. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting, I mean, that's what's happening in schools. You know, a lot of it is like toxic compassion kind of element of, you know, I tell my students, like, you all are victims of something. Like you want to look at how you've been victimized by the world. Everyone can see that. Everyone can see that. You know, my hair is falling out. I have birthmarks, whatever it is. You know, it could be something, you know, horrible abuse. Like everyone, there's a spectrum of what it means, but like, how is it going to serve you? And when we tell this stuff to young people, essentially to look for the ways you've been wronged in the world, look for the ways that you are a
You're
victim.
disadvantaged. Yeah.
Yeah. How is that going to serve you? That's going to just make you feel that way and see the world that way. That's not going to be the best approach to success, which is what the point of school is going to be. Try to equip these kids with skills so that they can go be successful. If you go out and you just think that the world, I mean, maybe some of them say like, oh, that'll put a chip on my shoulder to go out and hustle, but it tends to not have that effect. It tends to just look at all the negatives in their life, and then it's an easy out. And you know, since like 2020, when that like critical race theory stuff really got big, a lot of my friends who are in education, different places, you know, it would be kids who would say like, well, you failed me because of my skin color. You failed me because I'm this, because like of my identity. And it was really tough because in school, it's like, well, so the teacher's racist now. So then they had to go before like a board or before like the administration and kind of look at an A paper and a B paper and a C paper. And they had to do all that because it's such an easy win. Teenagers they're like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park, man. They're like testing the fences. How can I get out of any of this stuff? And they just say like victimhood. Anxiety is another one. And I know it's real, but like, you know, when college admissions come out at my school, they say like, if the kid needs to just, you know, go home and process it, they didn't get into their school, you know, we need to let them. It's like, you are out of your mind.
Can't you handle rejection? Like this is the coddling that is causing the increased level of anxiety because the anxiety is being used to control the environment. Yeah. You know, and this is it's an interesting line to play with because what you're saying, right, is like, and what I'm talking about is there's an idea that if we call out the exploitation of victimization, like the living in a victim space, that in some way it's not validating that there is true victimization, but we can actually live in both. And, you know, coming back to the idea of neurodivergence, which like clearly there's autism, there's Asperger's, there's all these different types of divergence. But, you know, in having a conversation with my friend who's a psychologist, she made a great point. She's like, if you were to ask me, do I think differently than most people? I would say yes. And she's like, so what is a normie and what is divergence? And, you know, I have a lot of friends, I'm in my 40s. I have a lot of friends now in their 30s, 40s who are like, oh, I just got diagnosed with ADHD. Everything makes sense. I'm on Adderall, which is like one molecule away from meth, I think. Yeah. So it's like it's very close to meth. But I'm like, that's fascinating because I think if everybody took a test on ADHD now, I'd say 90% of people would be ADHD. And I'm not minimizing the experience of someone finding comfort in like, this is the reason I don't pay attention is because I have some sort of divergence. I tested my audience. I surveyed them and I said, do you think differently than most people? 90% said yes. So they're like, oh, well, that's interesting. And I'm like, okay, well, in a world that celebrates short form content, there's constant dopamine hits. Phones are literally designed to rob you of your attention. Yeah. Of course you have short attention spans. Does that make you have ADHD or does that make you normal now?
Yeah.
And eligible for a drug.
Well, and also like for resources. I mean, because I love I think social programs are really important too. I mean, I think whether they're private or government funded, but like if everyone has this, so um, I know of a school, I'll say, I know of a school that's like a wealthy private school in LA, and 60% of the student body has an IEP, an individual education plan. So there's like special needs.
60%.
60%. They're not. I know these kids, they're not, but they have the resources to take a test like this and go, yeah, well, you know, they have trouble sitting still during class. It's like, yeah, because school sucks. So they get the extra time, they get extra, you know, they get like people helping them to go, they get extra time on tests and stuff like that. And then it'll boost up their standardized test scores and their GPA so that they can go to Yale or something like that. It's like a
So
hack.
they understand that.
So the resources, if everyone is, you know, if everyone can claim victim, then the resources that are supposed to go to actual victims. It's like if everyone, like if a battered, just using a metaphor of like a battered women's shelters for like women who, you know, their husbands are trying to kill them, you know, beat them up, knock their teeth out and stuff like that. So if a husband says like, you know, the meatloaf was a little overdone today, and she goes, oh my gosh, that's abuse, let's using this metaphor, then she goes to the battered women's shelter and takes a bed of someone who's getting hit, you know, with a chain or something like that. And I think that's a metaphor with what we're seeing a lot with like, especially kids, you know, because there are kids who really need resources, and there's other kids who just like, you know, they just don't have a lot of fortitude and a lot of grit. And that's, I think, another issue too.
What do you think is the way out of this? Like, I know that's asking a lot of, but like what is the antidote to ideological capture, culture, being enrolled in culture wars? I remember listening to a podcast where they were talking about how, you know, you've been captured when you're enraged.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I was captured.
you know, like, oh, sure.
But the ability for me, which I've had to develop because I'm in a healthy relationship with my wife, is like, oh, that's true. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not productive for my work, for me, for my partnership, for my friendships, right? And so it's like, okay, how do I shift this? Okay, I ask questions as you're talking about. So what do you think is the way through?
So essentially, I think that I'm biased. So I'm a teacher, so I would say education, and specifically what I'm trying to do, you know, like it's like Gandhi, be the change you wish to see in the world. So what I am trying to do now is build a critical thinking, you know, social science online platform. And I think because it's answering the exact question is like, what do I do? I just felt very helpless. Like there's something I want people to understand, asking questions, seeking disconfirmation, like having, you know, engaging in civil discourse, all of that kind of stuff. I think it needs to happen. So I said, you know what, like I'm taking a sabbatical from teaching. I'm going to go build a platform to try and get it out there, because I don't know, but I think that to structure and give easy to follow tips, bring people in who are like Zion Clark or someone like that, a guy who was born into foster care he has nothing below his waist. So it's just arms. And he became like a championship wrestler, and he's just like the man. He's just like awesome. And, you know, he has no victim mentality in him whatsoever, even though he absolutely could, but he has none of that. I think like platforming those people, showing them those examples, platforming people that are open-minded, people that for the ideological capture part, that you know, offer, you know, nuance in their views and stuff like that, and then giving young people, I think you have to start young. I think giving young people the tips and like the pathway to go on to be a critical thinker, a serious thinker, and not get ideologically captured. Because if you don't have like a goal, you don't have like a pathway, you don't have like a map for how to be, then you're just going to be picked up. Anyone who just says, come over here, going to go over there. I think that you're more likely to be brainwashed, indoctrinated, and stuff like that. So I think that it has to happen in schools, but I don't see it happening in traditional school systems. So I think that people have to build pockets of it. And then using tech nowadays, I think we can. I think we can build online education platforms and stuff like that to try and do it. So
yeah, I remember a friend of mine who's a teacher was saying in Canada, was saying that like one of the arguments to starting to create these sort of offshoot programs is that a lot of the resistance she gets when she talks about like homeschooling or starting a pod, right, and then working with kids, is that, well, then regular kids aren't getting it. It's only the wealthy kids or the kids who happen to be in the geography and be connected to the families or whatever. And while I understand that, I'm also like, well, it's got to start somewhere.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? Yeah. What is your platform called?
It's called Patterdocs.
Yeah.
So I named it that, just the idea that docs is like a belief, and then patterns we all know, like those, like replicating, ideas. So the idea is like, if you see a conflict between husband and wife, you can kind of understand the basic principles of that could lead to a conflict between two nations,
Yeah.
or you look at one war, you can look at all wars, like some people recognize what was happening during COVID because they know history. They know the pattern. Like you've seen, you being in pharmaceuticals and stuff like that, marketing, like the pattern that was playing out. Like, oh, I know this game. I know this playbook. Oh, okay, I know what this is. Markets. Like the 1920s stock market, and then the early 2000s, housing market. You can see these patterns, and then you can make better sense of the world. So it's a social science. It's history, civics, sociology right now, and it's going to be not just talking about the War of 1812, but what is the basic pattern under the War of 1812, and then how can that apply to you as like a 16-year-old, and then also to you as a 35-year-old down the road. So you don't need to know the basics of like who flanked who and then what battle. That's I don't care about that. It's the big underlying like structure of why things happen, why events happen, and then you can apply that out in the world. I think that makes you a more like cognizant and robust thinker to like make sense of the world.
It's so powerful because this is the way that we shift, and we shift it interpersonally, which shifts community, which shifts culture. And it's like someone's got to start.
I love that. It has to start somewhere. So even if it's small, like I needed to throw my hat into the ring a little bit, because even if I'm doing good stuff in my classroom, I still only have 3 or 4 classes of 25. And it's in one little pocket, in one little school, one little community. So we have the ability now to scale education. I think. I mean, people do it. You're doing education. It's just all these people. Andrew Huberman's doing education.
I think it could for sure be scaled. Yeah.
So why not for young people? You miss some level of like personal interaction, but you can create that too. So it just hasn't happened yet, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't. And that's why essentially that I'm excited to get it going.
Yeah, there's a model of dialogue from Harville Hendricks and Helen Hunt. They wrote a book called Getting the Love You Want. And they have a model for dialogue that is also a similar model to like how countries handle conflict. Obviously, they're not using it well right now, but it's called Imago Dialogue. And it is, the whole purpose of it is to first hear the other perspective, mirroring, validating. And so like through this, you can't even move on to your quote unquote side until you have mirrored and validated and the other person feels like it's
so complete. This is what you're saying. This is just want to be straight. This is your perspective, right? I don't want to get it wrong. Yeah. Okay. Now that's so like that.
Did I get it right? Is there more?
Yeah.
Which, I mean, whenever I learn or hear them speak, I'm always like, I need to put that back into more practice.
It's so good.
It is. If we can live it. And also what that does is it creates, from a nervous system perspective, co-regulation. So like, even though you might disagree with someone, I think this is such an important part of relationships and families, but especially romantic interpersonal relationships, is like, we can disagree and love doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Right now, when there's disagreement, belonging has been taken away, love is being taken away. And this has happened in history throughout. You get divorced, you're out of the community, you get, whatever it is. So it's like, there's no psychological safety. So it's like, can we create spaces of psychological safety? Because if there's psychological safety, then people feel safe to be themselves and to challenge perspectives. And what comes from challenged perspectives is broadened, more intelligent ideas. Yeah.
This is what we need.
Well, you're doing awesome stuff. I'm so grateful that you came on, said yes to this. I'm sure we'll get a poll from the audience so we can come and just tackle specific questions about ideologies, etc. Where can people find you? Where can they find Paradox?
So Instagram is the social media platform that I use. It's just my name, Will Rusch, WILLREUSCH. And then Paradox is just the way it sounds, PATTERDOX.
Perfect.
I'm excited to get it going and try and do exactly the stuff that you're talking about, and now try and get teenagers so they don't get ideologically captured when they're young.
That's so powerful. Thanks, man. I appreciate what you do.
This is cool.